In the grand ballroom where the chandeliers hung like frozen lightning and cameras from every angle beamed across the nation, Donald Trump sat with his trademark scowl, his chin jutting forward as though the weight of the moment rested only on him. And the crowd below shifted in anticipation because the air already crackled with the sense that confrontation was brewing. And when Jasmine Crockett, the firebrand congresswoman who had long since established herself as a thorn in Trump's, sighed, rose from her seat, and demanded the microphone, the entire room seemed to shiver as though struck by an invisible wave. For people knew instinctively that she was about to unleash something sharp, something that would cut through all the bluster and dominance that Trump had been attempting to project. Trump narrowed his eyes, leaning toward the aides clustered at his right, whispering in a voice that carried enough venom to poison the mood. "Get her out of here. Don't want her voice heard. Security, remove her." The words struck like a gavel, final, dripping with arrogance. And within seconds, 2 Secret Service agents and several hired guards began to move toward Jasmine. But she stood perfectly still, radiating the calm of someone who had already anticipated this exact maneuver. Her lips parting in a faint smile as gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras zoomed in, and the networks broadcasting live switched their focus entirely to her poised figure. Every reporter in the press pit leaned forward, sensing that history was about to carve a new line into its endless scroll. As the guards reached for her arms, Jasmine tilted her chin upward, refusing to flinch, and then she opened her mouth, speaking not in a scream or a rant, but in a single sentence, measured and deliberate. "Ah!" And that sentence carried across the room and into every living room in America. "If you remove me for speaking the truth, then you confess to the whole world that you fear it." The room froze. The guards hesitated, their hands hovering near her but not daring to close the gap. And the audience erupted into a spontaneous uproar, half clapping, half shouting, as Trump slammed his palm on the table and barked, "Do it! Wait, take her out!" But the spell had already been cast, because what Jasmine had said was no ordinary line, no fleeting retort, but a sentence that sliced through the very mechanics of power, forcing every person watching to confront the nature of authority, fear, and censorship in real time. And as networks replayed the sentence on a loop, the crowd's loyalty began to fracture, with whispers growing louder, spilling from row to row until Trump's command sounded less like the edict of a leader and more like the desperate tantrum of a man who had just been outmaneuvered by the clarity of a single phrase. The moment Jasmine's words rang out, something indescribable shifted in the air, as though the entire ballroom had been thrown into a vacuum where time itself slowed down. Every breath measured, every eye locked on the unfolding standoff, and the weight of her single sentence pressed, harder than any guard's hand could have upon her shoulders. The truth was, her calm defiance had redefined the entire dynamic of the night in an instant. Because while Trump had relied for years on spectacle, domination, and the raw force of his personality to bend rooms to his will, here stood a woman, unbothered by the noise, unshaken by the looming threat of security officers, and that unnerved him in ways that no critic, no journalist, no politician had ever done before. For her refusal to budge exposed not just the fragility of his command, but also the desperation underneath his performance of strength. Cameras continued to capture every detail, the twitch of Trump's jaw, the bead of sweat forming at his temple, the half-step hesitation of the guards as they recalibrated their instincts against the sudden roar of the crowd. And Jasmine's stillness, like a stone set in the middle of a raging current, unmovable, unflinching. Her allies in the audience rose from their seats, clapping, chanting her name, while even those who had not come as her supporters began to murmur, because people recognized courage when they saw it, and courage always shines brighter when contrasted. Against panic? Trump slammed his fist against the table again, his voice louder this time, rasping with frustration. "Do you hear me? Remove her now." But every time he spoke, it seemed to only strengthen her presence, because where his tone was frantic, hers had been calm, and people are drawn to calmness in the storm. The psychology of the room betrayed him, tilting against him even though he still believed he could force it back by sheer command. Reporters scribbled furiously. Headlines forming in their minds, Crockett silences Trump with one sentence. Security stalls amid public outcry. Clash turned tables and historic broadcast and networks cut to split screen, showing her serene defiance. Beside his reddening face, a contrast so vivid that it wrote itself into history before the event was even over. And as the guards made their second approach, Jasmine spoke again, not in another long tirade, but a few measured words that echoed. With the same precision as her first, history will remember who stood down tonight. That, too, struck deeper than any shove, because the guards, veterans of difficult assignments, suddenly found themselves caught, not in a routine removal, but in a moment where their actions would be replayed for generations. Their faces frozen. In judgment, if they carried out an order that history itself might condemn, and so they hesitated again, standing there with indecision while Trump fumed and barked at them like a man drowning, clawing at waves that refused to part. The crowd grew louder, emboldened, voices rising together, chants for Jasmine, boos at Trump, a swelling chorus that made the chandeliers tremble. And for the first time in a very long time, Donald Trump realized he was not in control of the room. What unfolded next was less like a political event, and more like the unraveling of an empire in real time. Because Trump, who had always thrived on keeping others off balance with insults, nicknames and bluster, suddenly found himself standing in the glare of lights that no longer obeyed his script. And the harder he tried to grip control, the more it slipped like sand through his fingers, each granule tumbling away into the open hands of Jasmine Crockett, who had done nothing more than stand her ground and speak with precision. That paradox alone electrified the nation. Because here was a man who had ruled rallies with chants, who had bent audiences with fury, but who now looked reduced, small, desperate, almost pitiful, next to a woman whose weapon was not volume but clarity. The cameras caught him gesturing wildly to his aides, whispering furiously to one, then another, demanding that the sound system be cut, that the lights shift, that the attention be redirected. But the machinery of spectacle had already betrayed him, because once a story writes itself in the eyes of the people, no technical trick can undo it, and Jasmine had become the center of that story. Her face was framed on television screens everywhere, her voice replayed, and every second she remained standing while security lingered uselessly, made Trump's fury look weaker. "You don't belong here," he shouted, his finger stabbing the air toward her, but even his words sounded hollow, drowned out by the chanting crowd that thundered back her name. For years he had relied on fear to make people step aside, but Jasmine had replaced that fear with shame at being complicit in silencing a truth-teller. Shame at following orders that reeked of insecurity rather than strength and shame, has a way of spreading faster than fear, corroding the foundations of control. The guards looked at one another, silently communicating, torn between obeying their orders and preserving their reputations, and Trump's voice cracked as he bellowed again, "Do your job." The phrase, once commanding, now sounded like pleading, and the more he raised his voice, the more brittle it became. Because he was no longer the conductor of a symphony, but the lone man screaming against an orchestra that refused to play his notes. Jasmine's allies began recording on their phones, broadcasting live to millions outside the official networks, spreading her defiance across platforms in real time, so that by the time Trump realized the depth of his mistake, hashtags were already trending worldwide, tweets multiplying by the second. Memes forming before the night was even over, each one portraying him not as the strong man he craved to be, but as the frightened king watching his crown slip. And still, Jasmine remained where she was, not moving an inch, her hands folded, her expression calm, her silence now as devastating as her words, because silence, too, is a kind of weapon when it belongs to someone who has already shifted the gravity of a room. In that silence, America saw something stark, that power is not always loud, and that when authority tries to crush dissent, sometimes all it takes to topple it is a single sentence, spoken with conviction. The crescendo of the night arrived not with Trump regaining command, but with the crowd itself transforming into a force he could no longer bend. Because by the time he barked his last desperate order for the guards to drag Jasmine Crockett away, the ballroom was no longer under his control. It belonged to the people inside it, and more importantly, to the millions outside watching with rapt attention. Their screens glowing with the replay of her sentence, their voices echoing online, swelling into a tide that dwarfed his once dominant presence. And as the guards froze for the third and final time, refusing to tarnish their names in history by dragging out a congresswoman whose only crime had been speaking, the silence around Trump became louder than any protest, the kind of silence that tells a man he is alone, abandoned by the very mechanisms he once believed would always obey him. He shouted, his face red, his fist pounding, but the sound was swallowed in boos, drowned under chants of "let her speak," that rolled like thunder, each syllable striking him harder than any blow. And Jasmine finally lifted her hand, gesturing gently for the crowd to calm, and when they did, falling into a hush that was almost reverent, she stepped forward and delivered not a speech, not a tirade, but a closing line that cut through every wall he had built. "You can order my silence, but you cannot order away the truth." Words reverberated, not just in the room, but across every network, across every living room, across every corner of the internet, until they became less a sentence and more a mantra, repeated, shared, engraved into the fabric of the moment. Trump's jaw slackened, his bravado drained, because in that instant, he knew that his attempt to humiliate her had backfired catastrophically, transforming her into a symbol of resistance and himself into the caricature of a tyrant undone by his own fear. Reporters surged forward, shoving microphones toward her, while his aides scrambled, whispering frantically, urging him to leave the stage before the optics worsened. But it was too late. The damage had been done, the narrative sealed. As Trump retreated, his shoulders slumped, muttering angrily at the few still loyal enough to hover near him. Jasmine remained, embraced by the people, lifted not physically but symbolically, as her one sentence echoed over and over again. And in the days that followed, that clip dominated the news cycle, played endlessly on social media, dissected by analysts, quoted by activists, taught in classrooms, etched into history, as the night Donald Trump tried to silence a voice only to amplify it 1,000-fold. He had told his security to remove Jasmine Crockett. But what he never understood until it was too late was that there are moments when power cannot be enforced by force, when authority collapses under the weight of a single sentence spoken, at the right time, with the right conviction, in front of the right audience. That was the night America saw the fragility of his bluster and the strength of her calm. And it was the night the myth of his unshakable dominance shattered before the eyes of the world.